Scooby-Doo. Hello, welcome to the Fantasy Frontline Podcast, where we use fake money to buy real F1 teams to win imaginary points. I am Paul. Ben is out today, and don't worry, he'll be back next week, and that's fine because he gets to postpone my eating crow for not putting a bunch of Ferrari on my team for one more week. So for anybody who is new to the show, first off, thank you for being new to the show. Appreciate it. But also, Ben has a lot more faith in Ferrari as a fantasy constructor than I do. I have plenty of faith in Mercedes, but previously I have been burned by Ferrari. So I normally don't go for Ferrari. And every time I have, they'll do something silly like get a double DNF. Well, it kind of plays into this week because Ferrari they did really well the last race, and Mercedes not so much. George Russell didn't get out of the middle of the pack, and Lewis Hamilton got a DNF, while Ferrari did exceptionally well. Charles Leclerc and qualified P4, Carlos Sainz qualified P3, and they finished P1, P2 ahead of Max Verstappen, and then both McLarens, and then George Russell, like I said, finished P6, and Lewis Hamilton didn't finish at all. So it was a decisive day for Ferrari. They didn't bring any upgrades. Mercedes, McLaren, Red Bull, they all brought plenty, and it seemed to work out really well for Ferrari. But I could spend a lifetime trying to figure that out. But the issue is going into the Mexican Grand Prix, all right? So if we turn back the clock and we look back to 2021, and I'm doing this to try and I'm looking back to 2021 real quick to try and see what happened then and see if there's any trends we can bring forward. For starters, in 2021, a Mercedes driver named Valtteri Bottas had the pole. His teammate, Lewis Hamilton, was P2 right behind him. In the first turn of the Mexican Grand Prix in 2021, Valtteri Bottas was spun out by a McLaren driver named Daniel Ricciardo. And Ricciardo lost his front wing, got some damage, all that. Mick Schumacher and Yuki Tsunoda didn't even finish the first lap of the Mexican Grand Prix in 2021. So lots of contact between the cars. And in 2022, it wasn't as bad. So Mercedes was P2, P3, and finished P2, P4, which ahead of both Ferraris, which, again, okay, that's good. There was some contact in the first lap, but nothing too crazy. And also, when it comes to 2023, let's remember that there was a Red Bull sandwich where Perez turned into the corner. He lurched ahead, turned into the corner, and sandwiched Charles Leclerc between he and Max Verstappen. Perez was out, but Charles Leclerc ended up finishing P3, all things considered. Not the real-world standings, mind you, but the fantasy standings. Max Verstappen is in the lead, got it with 354 points. Lando Norris is only, 60 behind him, and Charles Leclerc is only like 20 behind Lando Norris, then Piastri, and then Sainz. Where are both of the Ferraris? Well, both of the Mercedes, I'm sorry. Well, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell both have, half the points that Norris has, and they're both a solid 100 points behind Charles Leclerc. The issue with all of this, and this is what Ben reminded us about last week, is that just because they got the points in previous races doesn't mean they're going to get the points in the next race. So the conundrum I'm facing right now is, since it is obvious to me now that Mercedes doesn't have a good track record of doing well, and Ferrari does, do I switch out my teams with Ferrari? Do I switch out my Mercedes heavy fantasy teams with Ferrari for the last 5 races? And that's why I dove into previous events at the start of the Mexican Grand Prix in previous years, because my gut is telling me that based on everything, I need to get rid of Mercedes on my team, my fantasy teams, and get in and get a bit of an infusion of the Ferrari. But which should I swap out? Because I think the Ferrari constructor is overall better than the Mercedes constructor. But as soon as you have a McLaren constructor, which you absolutely have to have, otherwise you're being silly, if I don't have the Mercedes constructor, fine, but I can't not have a McLaren constructor. So you have to have McLaren. If you get Ferrari, that's good, but then you can't not have Lando Norris, and you can't have Lando Norris and have, Charles Leclerc. And if it sounds like I'm a little discombobulated, it's true. I am, because my entire strategy right now was lean on Mercedes, lean on McLaren, because Mercedes and Ferrari are really neck and neck. But after this last race, it was so dominant by Ferrari that if this is a indicator of what to expect going forward, it really needs to be Ferrari's game. And if you look back at the last 3 races, there's a very clear trend of Ferrari outperforming Mercedes, at least at the constructor level, at least as a group of drivers level. The exception to that is that I would say is George Russell, because even when he started 6th, finished 6th, he still put up in the 30s, which is good points-wise, fantasy points, which is great. But man, I just don't know going into Mexico. I don't know if Mercedes has it. And anybody who watches F1 or motorsports in general will tell you that just because somebody did good last year doesn't mean they'll be good this year. And is it weird? Is it silly for me to look back at what happened in 2021, 2022, and 2023 and say, well, there's their track record, that I should go ahead and have Ferrari in, or there's a track record, I should go ahead and have Mercedes in? Yeah. You're only as good as your last race. Last race, Mercedes was just not impressive, while Ferrari did very well. The previous race, still, man, it was at worst for McLaren. At worst, Mercedes is as good as Ferrari. At best, Ferrari is substantially better than Mercedes. So I think I won't drag through the entire setup of it right now, but I really think it's time for, at least for Mexico, to go ahead and do a switch over to Ferrari. Last year, Mercedes did do fine, but Ferrari has consistent, sustained, superior performance in Mexico, even when they're finishing in the top 6, even if they're qualifying and finishing in the top 6, even if they get into some action, where Mercedes not so much. So that is the big tip, and that's a big tip that I'm going to have a hard time accepting on my team, on my terms for my team, is that I really think that fantasy-wise, the last race in the United States was rough enough that for Mexico, need to heed the tea leaves, heed the writing on the wall, and keep your McLaren, absolutely. But if you are like me and are big into Mercedes, then it might be time to look at Ferrari, just because it seems like they are just doing better. And I need to stay. My goal for this whole podcast was to stay in the top 3%, and the last race dropped me out of the top 1 into the top 2% of the world. So need to keep this going. So that is that. I hope it helped. It just left me more confused, because now I have to go through and figure out how to make Ferrari fit into my team without, sacrificing all the consistency I have. But Ben will be back next week for us to continue the conversation, and I'm certain, especially if Ferrari does really well in Mexico, there'll be plenty of conversation about all that and about my hesitation to go to Ferrari.